Thank you, Nicola. Welcome to the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. This is another in our ongoing series of living history programs that really commemorates the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy, which is approaching this November in 2013. One of my jobs, as Nicola mentioned, is to manage our ongoing oral history project, and this is a dynamic initiative which has gathered over 1,000 memories of the life and death of President Kennedy and the history and culture of the 1960s. Many of you probably remember where you were when President Kennedy was shot, and if you'd like to be part of this archive of living history at the museum, it's very simple to contact us via our website, jfk.org. If you live here in the Dallas area, we can do a videotaped interview. If you're visiting us from out of town, it'd be easy to arrange a telephone recording, and you can be part of this archival project as well. Every so often, we have a remarkable storyteller that emerges from our oral history project, and we like to invite them here for a program, and that's what living history is all about. Before I introduce today's guests, I want to recognize a couple of very special guests in our audience today, as Nicola did. We do have with us the Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer Bob Jackson, who took a photograph which I'm sure everyone in this audience is familiar with, especially if you just came from the sixth floor. Bob took the photograph of Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Bob, stand up for a moment so we can acknowledge you. We're so happy to have Bob and his wife Debbie visiting us from Colorado, and we have another guest from the state of Georgia. Lieutenant Donald Sawtelle was also, like our guest today, part of the Death Watch rotation during President Kennedy's funeral services. So I'd like to recognize Donald Sawtelle as well, please. Lieutenant Sawtelle represented the U.S. Army, and our guest today represented the United States Marine Corps. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's very special guest. It's an honor to be here with Major William F. Lee, who served in the United States Marine Corps for 20 years, from 1951 to 1971, serving this country in both Korea and Vietnam. In 1963, then Lieutenant William Lee was stationed at the historic Marine Corps Barracks in Washington at the 8th and I Streets, and he was commander of the Silent Drill Team. And as a result of that, he was very much involved in the funeral services for President Kennedy on the weekend of the assassination. Please join me in welcoming Major Lee to share his story with us here today. Bill, let's set the scene first. Tell us a little bit about why the Marine Corps barracks at 8th and I Streets are so historic, and what your role was as commander of the Silent Drill Team.
The barracks is the oldest post of the Corps. It was founded in 1805. Interestingly enough, that at the time, the Commandant of the Marine Corps then, Colonel Burroughs, summoned by the President, Thomas Jefferson, and with Thomas Jefferson, went about to select the site for the Marine Barracks, the same site it is today. And he wanted it to be within easy marching distance to the Capitol. I was stationed at the barracks then, had the United States Marine Corps drill platoon. Besides performing with the platoon at the parades on Tuesday and Friday evening at the barracks, and elsewhere throughout the country, to include Dallas State Fair. We did most of, if not all, the joint service ceremonies in and around Washington. Strangely enough, the first president to visit the barracks since Jefferson was President John Kennedy in July of 1962. Not onanistic, but for those of us who were at the barracks, certainly, he held a special part of our lives, having come to the barracks.
You had several personal encounters with President Kennedy, and there's one story in particular when the Mona Lisa was in Washington, D.C., that you had a little exchange with the President.
Yes. Let me explain it. The President and I weren't drinking buds. These moments, one of which we're about to discuss, were just that, or just a moment, an eye contact. When they brought the Mona Lisa to the United States, it's first appearance was at the National Art Gallery in Washington, D.C. And on its first official night in the country here, the president had a special dinner, White House dinner, special guests. And as a treat after dinner, everybody came to the National Art Gallery. Members of my platoon, the drill platoon, we had the cordon, 2 lines, blue-white dress, just looking magnificent. 50 years ago, so I looked a lot better. And that was from the entrance to the elevator. All the guests came, they went up the marble stairs, but when the president came, he was going to ride in the elevator, along with Jackie and some other guests. I think his family members, Robert and Ethel Kennedy. It was a manually operated elevator. I think some of you remember those. Don does. Don does. He had his brown uniform on with the yellow piping, and he ran that elevator up and down. He practiced 45 minutes for his big moment. The president arrived, they came down through the cordon, they presented arms. I was standing close to the elevator, and the president and the first lady stopped probably within a foot. And I was in my usual mannequin pose, straight ahead, not even looking like I'm breathing. And they chatted, and finally Jackie said, well, let's go. The president said, yes, let's get on the elevator. They got on the elevator, doors closed. I'm thinking, good, show's over. Doors open, they get off, elevator wouldn't go up. Little gentleman inside tried to get it to go, wouldn't go. Meantime, the president and the first lady were standing right in front of me, just a foot away, and she was saying to him, Jack, let's just walk up the stairs. No, we'll wait, give the man an opportunity, we're going to take the elevator. A few moments pass. Jack, let's go up the stairs. People are waiting. No, let's wait, we'll wait for the elevator. A few more seconds or moments passed, and finally Jackie said, Jack, people are waiting upstairs, let's just go on upstairs. And I said, oh, all right. He turned to go, and just as he turned to go, he looked at me and said, don't worry about it. He said, I make all the big decisions. There was several moments here. I don't think I've ever told this to Stephen, but had swords. I was armed with a sword, and down at the order position, the tip was pointed in the ground. Well, she was standing so close that while this conversation was going on, I kept on thinking to myself in my mannequin pose, the tip of my sword is going to catch her down. We're going to have an incident here, and this is going to be really bad. So I just kind of slowly moved the sword back a little bit so it wouldn't catch. But anyway, it didn't, so saved the day.
You got to go to the White House on several occasions. What was it like for you as a young Marine lieutenant to be there in the nation's capital, to be in the White House in such close proximity to this young president?
Well, I think I've mentioned this before. It was I wasn't a guest. I was there for ceremonies, White House cordon, state dinners, rival ceremonies. But it seemed to be a unique opportunity to walk across the pages of history, so to speak, and never leave a footprint. I could see what they were reporting that evening or the next day on the news, the dignitaries, the heads of states, or whatever the occasion was, and knowing that I'd seen them hours before from several feet away. But, no one saw me. That was fine.
Friday, November 22nd, 1963. How did you find out about the assassination here in Dallas?
It was an off day for us at the barracks, off meaning that we had a inspector general's inspection that day, and myself and the drill platoon had, excuse me, had to take the PT test that morning at 6 o'clock. After that, the drill team played an intramural flag football game between the drill team and the color guard body bearer section. And I played in that game. Of course, that gave free hand to all the troops, the enlisted men, to take their shots at the lieutenant. All fair. We were playing in the game. We took a break. I guess it's halftime. And we were notified by a runner that came from the barracks that told us the president had been assassinated and was dead, and returned to the barracks immediately. Gathered up the things, went back to the barracks. We're given the news officially. Took our showers, shaved, got our uniforms on, and around 1:30 or 2 o'clock Eastern time, I guess, might have been a little later, we were taken to Gawler's funeral home. This was members of the Death Watch and the body bearer team. We were taken to Gawler's funeral home in Maryland because the apparent information said that's where they were going to bring the president. So it turned out, and we went to Gawler's funeral home. Already 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people were outside. It was misty, it was raining. When we got there, they asked me if I would provide security. I told them outside. I told them no. I'll help the security inside, but can't take the troops outside in the rain. We did that. I had to make a tour of the funeral home, which was not pleasant. Another sidelight, I think, didn't tell you that they brought us food. It was kind of like Dickey's Barbecue. It was a barbecued pork sandwich, which didn't sit well since I had to go through some of the recovery rooms, preparation rooms, and starting the security. We stayed there until early morning, 1:30, 2 a.m. in the morning, and we were told no, the president was taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland for the autopsy and for the preparation of the remains. And then we were taken with police escort back through the city to the White House and arrived there 2:30 in the morning. All the services, I think my mic, is it still on? Yeah. All the services went to Gawler's with the exception of the troops from Fort Myer, the old guard. Somehow they got better word than we did. And we all met up at the White House, I think, early in the morning.
When you got to the White House, you had an unpleasant encounter with a bystander, and it speaks to the emotional atmosphere after the assassination. Tell us about that.
We went as a group in various vehicles, police escort from Gawler's to the White House. And we pulled into the White House, there was obviously a lot of commotion. 2,000 or 3,000 people were outside the White House. And the Marine van, which I was riding in, got stopped for whatever reason, right on the driveway as we entered at the gate, and we got held up. I opened the door to the van to take a look to see what the delay was. And when I did, somebody yelled from the audience, "Damn Marines." It's about the time that it was obviously known and broadcast that Lee Harvey Oswald, who was a Marine, was the assassin. And then a woman sprung from the crowd and screamed the same thing and spit on me. Fortunately, she hit my Sam Brown belt, which was leather, and I had spit shined it anyway, so I shouldn't. Anyway, I'm sure she was caught up in the emotion of the time. Lee Harvey Oswald, the Marines, so didn't have really very good thoughts of us. But White House guard at the gate got her back into the crowd again, and we motored her inside, and the incident was over.
So what were you thinking as far as Oswald was concerned, knowing that he was a fellow Marine?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that I would consider him a fellow Marine. He was in the Marine Corps. Just not my Marine Corps, I guess, at the time. And he was what he was. Not a good feeling to have one of your brethren do something like this. No.
You're at the White House in the early hours of the morning. The president's body arrives. Tell us about the picture we're looking at here.
Yes. We formed the Death Watch from all the services, 5 services, the Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, and the Coast Guard. So it was a joint service ceremony or venture or a detail. And we were billeted in one of the subterranean levels of the White House. I think it was 2 floors down, in what looked to be a galley. Tables, chairs, berthing spaces. And we also were used to form a cordon from the East Room out to the entrance to the White House. And we did this about 3 times with 3 false alarms, which meant getting back in uniform, come up and form the cordon, be told it was a false alarm, go back downstairs, take the uniform off, repress everything. We did that about 3 times. But the 4th time it occurred was fairly close to 4 a.m., 4:30 a.m. My memory's fading here, but we formed the cordon, and I was right at the L of the cordon, and I felt somebody come up right next to me. We were at attention, and whispered in my ear, and he said, "My name is Captain Shepard." I think that was his name, Shepard. He was a naval aide to the president at the White House. He said, "I've just called Marine Barracks and asked for 12 Marines over here as an escort for the body, the remains, to escort the remains from the gate to the White House." He said, "I want you to go outside and take charge of them." He said, "Do what you have to do." My first reaction, well, of course, was yes. First reaction was, I certainly hope whoever called these Marines from the barracks, as good as all the Marines were at the barracks, I surely hope they called those 12 guys from my drill team. Because we were going to have to conjure up what we were going to do. And sure enough, marching back to the White House, coming out, were 12 young men from the drill platoon. They were being led by Lance Corporal Jack Lord, and he reported to me, and I said, "Take them outside, form them in 2 ranks, face the White House. I'll be out, and we'll be underway." Went out there, faced them, marched them down the driveway, counter-marched them, brought them back up, put them at ceremonial ease. This is somewhat interesting, and I went to check them personally, and while I was doing so, it took 30 or 35 minutes they were in the sack, they were asleep. And here they're standing here ready for ceremony in their dress blue uniform. So I was checking to make sure we had buttons buttoned and everything was shipshape. And at the same time telling them, so they could hear me, but not loud enough for the press to hear, how we were going to carry this up. How we were going to march up, face outward when we get up to the White House, about face, we'd present arms when they removed the casket from the hearse. Ask them any question, if you have one, I'll repeat it. While this is going on, of course, there's a lot of press around. I read later in Manchester, right? William Manchester's book, The Death of a President, buried somewhere at page 256 or something, was a wonderful comment of how dignified the Marines looked at the gate with their heads bowed in prayer for the president. Tell them what we were going to do and buttoning collars. That was what's going on down there. Anyway, this is the detail, and we led the Navy hearse with the remains up to the front entrance of the White House, where the Joint Service Body Bearer Detail came out and unloaded the remains, the casket, to take it into the East Room of the White House.
Well, let's pick up the story there in the East Room. Give us a sense of what the Death Watch rotation involved. You were standing at the head of the casket as a commissioned officer. You'd have these rotations every half hour. Tell us about that.
Joint service, again, Death Watch, every service was represented. There was an officer, for most part, in the daylight hours, although it didn't occur this first day. There was an officer at the head of the casket from a service, and then 4 non-commissioned officers, each from the other services. So on the very first Death Watch, there was an Army lieutenant, Don, and then there was a Marine, a sailor, a Coast Guardsman, and an Air Forceman standing at the corners of the casket. I came on the second watch. The watches were set up for 30 minutes on. You could stand at attention or parade rest. The watch got on and off, marched on and off, with no commands. It was all silent movements, pre-rehearsed supposedly, not in all cases. Stood 30 minutes and watch, and he had 2 hours between watches, obviously. And that sounds like a lot of time. The fact is, it took you about 20 minutes after you were suited up to march solemnly on the watch into the East Room, go on up and sidle up next to your counterpart to make a silent exchange of the watch. And then another 20 minutes for that watch to get off. Go down below. The first thing you did was take your uniform off, and guess what? Press it. In the case of the Marines, we had to shine all the brass buttons. In my case, shine the Sam Brown belt, shine the sword, get a cup of coffee. Then it was time to suit back up again and go on watch again. So it seemed like would have been a long time, but the time went by very quickly. The watch in the East Room. First, as you can see in the photograph in the background, there were 2 Jesuit priests that while the president lay in repose in the East Room, which is not open to the public, the priests were saying prayers, so when you stood at the casket, you could hear this going on. You couldn't hear the words, the prayer itself, you could hear it going on. There was nothing else going on. It was just total silence. For the troops that stood the sentries at the corner of the caskets, you can see there were candles there. Just think about that. They didn't move those until I think it was the third watch. And I had asked, I think, Captain Groves to get them moved. The candle was exactly at eye level for the non-commissioned officers at the corner of the casket. It just hypnotizing, the flickering of the flame, and that's what actually happened to one of the guardsmen, I think, on the third watch. But you were there, you and the president, and alone with your thoughts. And in my case, in the East Room, on most all the watches, except one I think we're going to talk about, was the Mass, is that it was better to do something with your mind, math problems, anything, than they get drawn in like an ebb tide into a current of emotion, just thinking, because there wasn't anything else to do. And if you had some incidents like I had with the president, then I started thinking about him, and I just had to be careful that I didn't get drawn into the emotion a minute. It seemed that 30-minute watch went by like that, except at the same time, it seemed like it lasted forever. It was a long 30 minutes, really.
You observed the First Lady on Saturday. Tell me about that.
At the Mass. I think it was either my second or third watch. I was on and paying at attention, the perfect mannequin. And I noticed they were setting up chairs on the far end at the foot of the casket. And obviously some event was going to take place. It turns out they were going to have a private family Mass. Captain Groves came up while I was on watch, whispered in my ear that they were going to have a Mass and they weren't going to change the watch, to stay there. And furthermore, don't move, stay at attention. So myself and the young men were with me. We stayed on watch for a normal watch and then went through another about 15 minutes while they set up and got everybody in, another 40-minute Mass. The worst part about that was that Jackie Kennedy and John and Caroline and the Kennedy family were sitting in the first row at the foot of the casket. So there wasn't any other place to look other than straight ahead, and there they were. So it was a battle trying not to get caught up in it. And after the Mass was over, everybody left, shuffling. Certainly, I don't know who was there, frankly, probably members of the White House staff and whatnot. I don't recall seeing any cabinet members. They might have been there. But when all of those folks left, it was just the family. And each of the family, first Ted Kennedy and his wife, came to the foot of the casket and knelt down and prayed, and then they left. And Robert and Ethel did the same thing. So if you can see where I'm standing there, off to the right of that back of that sailor, in essence, they were right down there. So I was right ahead, and the family was down here. Then when Jackie Kennedy came with Caroline and John, gentleman, I think, from Guller's Funeral Home that came in and pulled the flag down and opened the top half of the casket. And then Jackie, and along with the children, were saying prayers down there. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the voices. Like now, I could feel myself going down with them. And I knew I just had to suck up some air here because I had to get through this. And when she finished the prayer, she got up, and somebody took Caroline and John out of the East Room, and she put something in the casket. Don't ask me. Whatever they printed, whatever they said, I guess that's whatever she put in the casket. I didn't see it. I just know she put something in the casket, whispered something, and then turned and left. When she turned and left, and I could see her from a peripheral vision leaving, I have to admit to you, I cheated. I let my eyeballs drift to the right side of my head to see where she was, and I picked her up, looking back at the casket. It was the most forlorn look I think I've ever seen on a person's face. That stands out more than anything, I think. My remembrance about Jackie Kennedy was that look. Anyway, the good news is she left. I could see the relief watch going on, and I was one tired Marine, and that watch was over.
The death watch continued in the rotunda of the Capitol. Same thing, but a totally different dynamic for you with the media lights and the steady parade of bystanders. How was that different from your experiences in the East Room?
Well, one was total silence, just you and the president, and the other was the world. Don can probably relate to this, but some humor. The floor in the rotunda is marble, and it's shiny, and it's slicker than an ice pond. And part of our uniforms in the band, we had leather soles and heels on, and metal horseshoed cleats around our heels, and some metal toe taps on. So all those nice clicking noises you hear when they march and they snap to attention. On the rotunda floor, it was worse than being on ice skates. I don't know about Don, but your mind would say, please don't let me slip out here, But standing there, all the TV lights were behind us in the rotunda. And when they were on, which they were most of the time, it was like 150 or 180 degrees burning down your neck. At the foot of the casket, across the rotunda, the doors were open to the outside. The people were pouring in. It was November. It wasn't ice cold, but it was in the 30s or high 20s. So you got the cold air, 32 degrees on your forehead, 180 degrees on your neck, perspiration running down the back of your neck, I guess icicles. And the people, when they came in, everybody came towards the foot of the casket, and it seemed like everybody had a flashbulb camera. And just flashbulbs were just going off. So it wasn't long, within a matter of seconds, once you got on watch, that you started seeing little yellow and green squirrels and bugs and everything in your eyes. You just couldn't see anything. in their peripheral vision, you could see the people moving, a little nauseating. And when you allowed yourself to get in the moment, then you could hear people crying, you could hear people praying. The best thing to do was look straight ahead, pick a spot out on the wall, and go into the mannequin pose, because it was just pandemonium in there. I don't know what was 250 or 300,000 people passed through that casket that time it was in the rotunda. Quite a time.
When the Death Watch concluded in the Capitol, that was the end of your participation in the funeral ceremonies, and you, like everyone else, watched the actual funeral on television.
Packed my gear, my dress blues, went back to the barracks, and went home and sat down and watched the rest of things on television with my wife. One tired puppy.
You received a commendation from the United States Army for your services during the funeral. Tell us about that.
Some members of the Death Watch, I'm not sure who all, in this case, myself and the two body bearers, the two Marines, Lance Corporal Cheek and Lance Corporal Diamond, also received the Army Commendation Medal for a performance on the Death Watch for John F. Kennedy. Certainly there were other services. I'm sure Don, those in the Army. Certainly Sam Bird, for one, who was an Army lieutenant who was in charge of the body bearers.
And the medal that you received, you donated to the museum this week, and we're honored to have it, and we hope to add it to your display downstairs. And speaking of your display, this wonderful sword that we've had on display on the 6th floor. Most of you probably saw it today. If not, you can certainly see it after the program. It's been on display here for several years. There's a story about that sword and the scabbard. Tell us about that.
Well, Mameluke sword for Marine officers to carry. I noticed that they haven't kept it as highly shined as I would like, but that's all right. I just know that my next contribution here will be a can of Brasso. The sword, certainly, as you can see, is not something that we Marines carry in combat, at least not since the days of wooden ships and sails. But it's a sword for Marine officers. In this case, this sword was given to me by the troops that I served with in 1st Force Recon Company when I was an enlisted man. And they got together after I was commissioned and purchased a sword for me and gave it to me. It had my name's engraved on it. So its history is meaningful to me because guys I worked with and jumped with in Force Recon and landed in rubber boats and some of the grisly good stuff are the ones I remember.
Wonderful. Well, we're honored to have it here. If you filled out a question card for Major Lee, if you'll pass those to the end of your rows, we will pick those up and try to get through as many questions as we can. As we wrap up our portion of the program, I want to point out that since retiring from the Marine Corps, you've become an award-winning writer, and you've written 6 novels, and one of which is about the Kennedy funeral. Now, why did you decide to tell your story, and it very much is your story in the book? Why did you decide to write that as a novel instead of a biography, autobiography?
Interesting. Book's entitled The Boys in Blue White Dress. I didn't intend to be a writer at any point in time in my life until after I got to a point in retirement. I couldn't play golf anymore. And my wife gave me a couple of limited choices. One was to get out of the house and leave her alone, or do something productive, and I chose to write. I wrote this book, and it's called General Fiction. And the book's fictionalized in that I did not use the real names of the officers that served with me at 8th and I. And I changed my name in the book to Barney Quinn. Thought it sounded better than Bill Lee. And I intended to write other novels, and I wanted to get some experience in writing and building characters in the book. So, and I was going to tell some stories about the bachelor officers that I served with at 8th and I. So in order to do that, I made Barney Quinn a bachelor and let him live in the bachelor quarters so I could tell the stories on them and myself at the same time and use fictionalized names so I wouldn't embarrass them. What I didn't know, but all the events in the book are factual events, things that actually happened in the barracks. And I took the time in the book to put into words my thoughts at different points along the route of standing the death watch, on the way to Gawlers, at Gawlers, in the White House, at the rotunda, the different events, the things that were running through my mind. And then I would reflect, in the rest of the book, I reflected on my other portions of duty at the White House and some of the stories with the president. You know.
Well, we have the book available for sale here in the back of the gallery, and after today's program, Major Lee will be at that table right over there, and he'd be glad to personalize and sign your books and also meet you and answer any other questions you may have. While we're waiting on these question cards, let me ask you about this momentous anniversary that we're approaching, the half-century mark of the Kennedy assassination. Having been there, having been a part of the ceremonies at the White House and the Capitol, what does this half-century mark mean to you?
It means I've gotten old real quick. And I wish I looked like I did when I was 29. Well, I don't know. That's just a personal opinion. To be absolutely truthful, I think I have the same feelings now, today, that I did then. I always go back and just reflect on the moment and reflect what was running through my mind and reflect those personal moments, at least in my mind, the personal moments I had with the president, like the Mona Lisa. There's another time at a ceremony when he and the dignitary passed in front of the troops. President Kennedy just looked in the ranks, and he looked at me again and caught my eye, and I knew he was saying, "You're still here." And another time at Camp David, which is a retreat in the mountains, I had to pull watches up there also that we were waiting for the president to arrive, and I was sitting in a radio jeep. Jackie was there, obviously the Secret Service, and John was there, and they sent John over to me. He wanted to sit in a radio jeep, and he had a little toy airplane he was flying around like this. So I put him in my lap and let him fly his airplane around and show him how to land it on the windshield and whatnot. And when the helicopter started coming with the president, I had to get on the radio. I sent John back via the Secret Service man to the First Lady. When the president landed, got off the chopper, went over to see, obviously walked towards the First Lady, and then John ran towards him, jumped in his arms, and the president was holding him in his arms, and I could see him, flying his plane, and I was still sitting in the Jeep, and then he was telling his father something, and President Kennedy looking around like this shoulder again, and telling him, looking again, and then he, caught me right in the eye, and he was saying, "It's you." So anyway.
Well, I want to get to a few audience questions. One of them is, where did the term Death Watch come from?
That's a good question. What I know of the circumstances is, maybe Don knows the history. President will lay in repose for 24 to 48 hours. And if he's a sitting president, he will do that in the White House. That's the East Room. And that is private. After that, the president will lay in state in the Capitol, the rotunda. Maybe there's nothing more tricky about it than we're on watch and president's dead. I don't know where Death Watch comes from.
I think that's a great answer.
You don't know either. Just so you get some. The old guard at Fort Myers and the Marine Corps at 8th and I, we had a quiet, private rivalry who was the sharpest? The Army? Or us fine-looking Marines in our blue white dress?
Well, it's nice to see the two of you getting along so well today.
50 years will do that.
Did
Always friendly, though. It was always friendly.
Did you keep track of how many individual rotations you participated in?
No, I didn't. I can't answer. I maybe total a dozen. I'm not sure.
You've lived here in the Dallas area for a long time. Do you remember having any thoughts about Dallas during the weekend of the assassination?
Not really. If I did, they probably weren't pleasant ones. Probably associated with, I think naturally maybe associated the city of Dallas with the assassination of our president. Unfairly so, for sure.
Did the president's death have a long-term impact on your life?
Who is asking these questions? I don't know. Probably did. I mean, I certainly have been asked about it enough times. I certainly remember it. Certainly had an emotional impact at the time. It's lasted. I don't think I can hear the name, see a picture. Certainly can't drive past Dealey Plaza. Anything that triggers it, will bring it back to me. You need to. Is that water? Yes.
We have time for one last question.
I guess it is.
This is a very interesting question. If something like this were to happen again, what advice would you give your Marine Corps counterpart?
He probably wouldn't listen to me because he probably thought he would be thinking that he was a little better than I was at standing ceremonies. But he wouldn't be. I was a legend in my own mind. Time. I would tell him that you just can't get caught up in the moment. You just can't do it. And the minute you let that sleep, that nanosecond that you let that slide, that feeling slide, and you do get caught up, you'll just get just as emotional as those around you. And you just can't do it. It's not part of the job. Pick a spot. Look like you're not breathing. Don't blink. Do math problems. Stay out of it emotionally. And just walk across the pages. Just don't leave a footstep.
All right. That's all the time we have today, but Lieutenant Lee will be over here signing books in a few moments. Please join me in thanking Bill Lee for his service and for being here today. Thank you. Appreciate it.